Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, reptoids and fish people. It's time to take a trip into the realm of insanity, where we'll discover the craziest, most ridiculous, most off-the-wall, paranoid, batshit crazy conspiracy fruitcakes on YouTube. And remember to stay tuned and find out how to vote for the winner of this year's Illuminuti Achievement Award. Also, feel free to submit any lunacy you may find. You can send it to me on here or on Twitter with the hashtag Illuminati Achievement. Enjoy!
So, I found a good bit of dumb fuckery for you today. This imbecile thinks our space program is a hoax because he doesn't understand things. And before we get started, just a heads up, I'm going to mute the beginning of his video because I don't want to get a copyright for the music he uses. So instead, I'll be playing from The Fintronaut. Go check him out, give him a sub, and the link is in the description.
We're NASA.
Hey guys, how's it going? So my question for NASA is, how are you ensuring the safety of our astronauts in a vacuum?
Well, the simple answer to that would be with the spacesuits and the shuttle.
I want to make sure our astronauts have the proper training to survive the deadly vacuum of space.
Well, the astronauts are highly trained, but if they're caught in the vacuum of space without the protection of the shuttle or their suit, no amount of training could help them. They're fucked.
Proper training means you train in an environment that most closely resembles the harsh environment you'll be exposed to. Now, there are two issues that I have with NASA's training practices. Number one involves the fact that NASA trains astronauts in a swimming pool, when in actuality they are supposedly going to be working in the exact opposite environment of outer space.
They train in a pool because it's the closest we can get here on Earth to weightlessness, which is something they're going to have to deal with being in space. Now, being concerned about safety, a pool is a lot safer than, well, just shooting them off into space and making them train there. Fucking moron.
And my second issue with NASA is its ability to even create a vacuum here on Earth that is sufficiently similar to the alleged vacuum of outer space.
A vacuum chamber here on Earth that would simulate the vacuum of space is very expensive to build. Also, as far as training and safety goes, it's a lot safer to train in a pool where you have divers that can pull them to the surface if something goes wrong, rather than a vacuum chamber where if something goes wrong, they're more or less fucked. You're like 2 minutes into this video and already your inconsistencies are mind-blowing.
So before we begin, let's see how NASA creates a vacuum here on Earth. So this here is the Great Space Power Facility at NASA's Plum Brook Station in Sandusky, Ohio, which they built with our money. This is the world's largest and most powerful and expensive vacuum. Some of the test programs that have been performed at the facility include high-energy experiments, full-scale rocket fairing separation tests, Mars lander system tests, deployable solar sail tests, and International Space Station hardware tests. I mean, construction costs were astronomical. So is the upkeep and maintenance. And obviously there's no astronaut training going on in there.
There you go, you're getting it. That's part of the reason why. You're answering your own questions. Way to think things through.
And a little later, I will show you exactly what they do with it. They use it for propaganda videos and drop a feather and a bowling ball. Ugh.
Oh, and here we go with the conspiracy nuttery. Everything is propaganda.
Anyways, so first off, this chamber makes a high vacuum. That's all it can do. And this high vacuum is 3 levels before the vacuum of outer space. So it's not even as powerful as the vacuum of space in which they will be working.
I'm willing to bet that this turd in the gene pool would have a problem with it if NASA trained astronauts in there because, well, it's not an exact replica of the vacuum of space. It's goddamn close, but not exact, so he'd still have an issue with it.
And for those of you who don't think a vacuum is powerful, and that the pressure difference between a vacuum and the atmosphere in which we live is not powerful, check out what a vacuum can lift, and then think about what it would do to a puny tin can in space, or a wimpy spacesuit, especially over time, or if there's any minuscule imperfection or leak. So check this out.
Yes, the vacuum of space is very dangerous. That's why they test the suits. They do regular maintenance on the space station and the shuttles when they were still being used to ensure that there were no small leaks or anything like that.
We're loading 42-inch 480 wall steel pipe, 3 to a truck. Pipe are about 40 feet in length, and they weigh about 9,000 pounds. We're loading them with an AccuVac vacuum attachment on a 450 John Deere hoe. Pipe weigh about, I think I said the pipe weigh about 9,000 pounds a piece. This vacuum attachment will pick, this one I think will pick 30,000 pounds. That's 15 tons just on a vacuum.
So I guess this short bus rider doesn't understand that there's a difference between a vacuum, like in his video, and a vacuum chamber or the vacuum of space. They're not the same fucking thing. I wonder how far up his ass he had to reach to find that little nugget. This is anal spelunking at its finest, folks.
Now that's power. And it is funny how the vacuum chamber, like a submarine, has massively thick walls to withstand the difference in pressure. This is because, in the case of a submarine, the submarine must survive the difference in pressure that exists between the ocean, deep in the ocean, and the ground level atmosphere inside the submarine. Without very thick and structurally sound walls, the pressure difference would crush the sub. Likewise, the ISS and the spacewalking astronauts must survive the opposite but equally harsh difference in pressure that exists between the vacuum of space and the normal atmosphere inside their suit or inside the space station.
Yes, anybody who passed the 5th grade understands there's a difference between atmosphere on Earth and the vacuum of space. But then again, his video is talking to flat earthers and people like that, so yeah, maybe that 5th grade refresher might be needed.
So again, it's funny that they need extremely thick and structurally solid walls for a submarine and a vacuum chamber, but for some reason, in the more powerful vacuum of outer space, you can survive in a flimsy spacesuit or the tin can known as the ISS. Sounds legit.
So, like every other conspiracy theorist, he is now trying to deliberately mislead his audience by saying that the ISS is a flimsy tin can and that spacesuits are very thin. The Kevlar blanket covering the ISS is 10 centimeters thick. Each window is made out of 4 panes ranging from 1/2 inch to 1 1/4 inch thick. 1/2 inch on the inside to 1 1/4 inch for the outside pane. The pressure shield under the blanket is 1.27 millimeters thick and made of aluminum, designed to spread the impact of meteorites, that might get through the blanket over a large area, thus avoiding penetration. Then, under that, there is a 4 to 7 millimeter thick titanium shell. Hardly a flimsy tin can. Spacesuits are made of 16 layers of material, with a hard fiberglass shell on the inside over the torso. The spacesuits are 3/16 of an inch thick, and they are made of nylon tricoat, spandex, urethane-coated nylon, Dacron, neoprene-coated nylon, Mylar, Gore-Tex, Kevlar, and Nomex. Also, some of the fabrics used on EVA suits have an aluminum coating. So, yeah, nothing flimsy, weak, or thin about spacesuits either.
To illustrate this even further, on the vacuum scale, this monstrosity of NASA, our great space power facility, is only a high vacuum. You can see from the chart that outer space is 3 levels of vacuum beyond NASA's most powerful vacuum, which they don't even train in anyways. And all of NASA's other vacuum chambers are only medium vacuums.
The vacuum of space has very little to do with the astronauts' day-to-day stuff that they need to do. Their main obstacle is the lack of gravity, which is why they train in a pool. In a pool, you can achieve neutral buoyancy, which is very close to a zero-G condition. I don't know why he's harping on about training in a vacuum. That will have little to no effect on what they do on a day-to-day basis. Also, he talks about safety. Training in a vacuum is a lot more dangerous than training in a pool.
So right there, that's a fail. They can't even recreate the vacuum of outer space. And they don't train in a vacuum. There's almost no footage at all of any astronauts even in a vacuum chamber. And plus, they even tell you it's their policy to only train underwater.
Because the vacuum of space has very little to do with what they do on a day-to-day basis. And also, your picture of a vacuum over space is another attempt to mislead your audience. Space is not like a fucking vacuum cleaner. They're essentially different types of vacuums.
They don't train in a vacuum chamber. This is a complete fail. I'll come back to this point in a minute, but before that, I want to discuss the major problems I have with NASA's policy of training astronauts in a gigantic swimming pool.
This should be good.
And really, the only alleged benefit of training underwater in a pool, they say, is that it simulates zero gravity. Well, actually, it doesn't even simulate zero-G. It only simulates zero-G on camera.
I guess this guy's never heard of a little thing called neutral buoyancy. This is a diving fundamental skill. Learning to make yourself neutrally buoyant, so you're not ascending and you're not descending. You're essentially, well, weightless. And you can also move in any direction at any time. It's pretty cool once you figure out how to do it.
In a video, making videos, but not in practice. To summarize why training underwater is a complete fail, I made a list of 8 problems with training underwater as opposed to training with something like a zero-G wire system in a warehouse.
Oh, this should be good. All right, let's have the list.
So here we go. Number 1, pressure underwater is the complete opposite of the vacuum of space. Underwater, the pressure is extremely high and will compress. It'll crush you with extreme force. In a vacuum, pressure is extremely low. There's no pressure. And you will explode. Your spacecraft will explode with the extreme force, and it will do so outward, the opposite direction of underwater. So why in the world would you train under conditions that are opposite those in which you will be working? This makes no sense at all. Total fail.
As discussed earlier, the spacesuit protects the astronaut from the vacuum of space. They are designed to negate the effects of the vacuum, essentially making the vacuum of space irrelevant, unless, of course, the suit's punctured. That being said, the only difference between working in a vacuum or underwater in the suit is the speed of movement is slower underwater due to the pressure and friction created by the water.
Number 2, resistance in movement. Underwater, moving around and pushing off of things will be much slower and tedious as opposed to the vacuum of space. At least if training is done in a warehouse on wires, there will be less resistance, which is at least closer to the complete lack of resistance in space. Water is the exact opposite of a vacuum. There's a great deal of resistance when you move around underwater.
Okay, so he's partially right on this point. Movement speed is slower underwater, but not tedious. However, slower movement speed is a very minor gripe. In fact, slowing things down often helps people learn skills. Take learning to bat in Little League. Coaches will throw the ball slowly so the kid can learn the mechanics of hitting the ball and get used to actually hitting the ball instead of just swinging and missing all the time. Training astronauts in a warehouse with wires would do little to help them get used to zero-G conditions, and also their movement is restricted by the wires. In a pool, they have freedom of movement in any direction at any time, whereas in a warehouse, if you have wires on your right and left, you can't roll your body right and left. You're restricted by the wires. So, yeah, that's another fail on his part.
Number 3, it makes no sense to construct a full-scale model of the ISS underwater. An ISS replica could easily be constructed in a large warehouse or a hangar. It would be much easier to build, maintain, modify, etc. This is just silly to do it underwater.
Since training underwater simulates zero-G and astronauts work on the ISS in zero-G, building an ISS replica underwater so astronauts can train with it makes perfect sense.
Number 4, teams of safety divers and camera crews must also risk their lives underwater for astronaut training, with the unnecessary burdens of tanks, gear, tools, parts, cameras, production equipment, etc. Instructors could be more helpful in a normal environment with astronauts on wires in a warehouse. It would also be easier for the camera crews to fake it.
Again, he's trying to mislead his audience. The tank is 202 feet long, 102 feet wide, and only 40 feet deep. Diving in the tank is less risky than a recreational dive in a lake. When someone gets their basic open water certification, that's the beginner diving certification, they're certified to a depth of 60 feet. Advanced open water certified divers are certified to 120 feet. Both are considered recreational diving certifications. The divers that NASA hires are professionals. They have more training than recreational divers and are in a controlled environment working in the best possible conditions. Hell, they don't even really need to be concerned about getting the bends. Granted, it's always a possibility, just a very incredibly unlikely one. Tanks, gear, parts, tools, and cameras aren't really a burden. And I love how he throws in the production equipment in that little comment, even though NASA doesn't use any. I guess he felt he had to add that in so he could make his allegation that NASA fakes everything. I already addressed why warehouse and wires is a terrible idea and would fail for actual zero-G training purposes.
Number 5. It costs millions to maintain the gigantic swimming pool. The underwater ISS model, the crews, equipment, it would be a fraction of the cost to use a warehouse with wires and a normal ISS replica. Common sense.
Yeah, putting a ISS replica in a warehouse and training the astronauts with wires would be cheaper and easier to maintain. But they wouldn't get to experience the zero-G feeling of neutral buoyancy and learning how to work in that environment.
Number 6, the performance and integrity of a spacesuit underwater is going to be the opposite of how it would perform and hold up in a vacuum. Training on wires at normal atmospheric pressure would at least be closer to movement in a vacuum than underwater, and how a spacesuit would react. A real vacuum chamber testing would be the best, but again, training underwater makes no sense.
They don't use the same suits underwater as they do in space, you fucking retard. They're modified training suits. They're the same thickness and feel, but specifically designed for underwater use. The suits they use in the pool aren't designed to deal with the vacuum of space, so that part of his problem is completely irrelevant. And again, training in a vacuum wouldn't simulate zero gravity and is more dangerous than training in a pool.
Number 7, weight distribution, inertia, movement, and reactions would be completely different underwater. Training to move and work with zero-G wire systems in a normal atmosphere would be closer to the alleged vacuum of space.
Okay, I'm getting a little tired of saying this, but again, the vacuum of space is a completely separate thing than zero gravity. Now, to break this down, weight distribution is a non-issue since neutral buoyancy is almost weightless, just like in zero-G conditions of space. You barely notice your tank when diving. The only difference with inertia is that if an astronaut pushes off an object in the pool, the astronaut won't float off forever. The reactions will be slower underwater, but that's essentially it. Saying a wire system would be better is fucking retarded. With a wire system, there'd be no form of neutral buoyancy, and the astronaut would feel the full effect of the weight of the suit and the suit's weight distribution. Pushing off an object would be even more restricted because of the wiring system. The trainee could only move as far as the wires would let him. Movement speed would be quicker, though. I'll give him that.
Number 8, spacesuits, gear, tools, equipment, spare parts, etc. are all designed for use in space, in a vacuum, not underwater. Tools such as drills, wrenches, hammers, bolts, quick releases, they would all behave completely differently underwater. This makes no sense to train to use these underwater.
As I mentioned earlier, they don't use spacesuits when training in the pool. They use modified versions of them that are designed and built for underwater use. He doesn't specify what gear, equipment, spare parts he's talking about, so I won't really comment other than to say that most likely the stuff that they use is made for underwater use, or they're dummy mock-ups of parts. Things like wiring harnesses that aren't live, for example. His comments about drills, wrenches, bolts, and quick-release parts behaving differently underwater is complete bullshit. Commercial divers use all of those things every day. How would a bolt or a wrench behave any different underwater? You turn the nut onto the bolt and you tighten it down with a wrench. You put the wrench on and you pull. I have lots of quick release stuff on my dive gear and it works the same in or out of water. You push the button and the two pieces separate, or you just simply pull them apart. This guy can't possibly be this clueless. His entire statement is a flat-out lie.
I'm astonished by how difficult it is to actually move around. The idea, like from the movie Gravity, that you could like reach out and grab something with one of these gloves? No way. Not gonna happen.
So, there are no benefits to training underwater, in my opinion.
Because that opinion is based off of sheer ignorance and, well, stupidity and bullshit.
But there are many disadvantages and outright dangerous issues if you train underwater.
But yet, he seems to think that training in a vacuum chamber would be safer. What happens to the human body when it's exposed to a vacuum? There's a reason that the spacesuits and ISS are built to protect us from the vacuum. Because we die if shit goes wrong. In the pool, They can just go to the surface and everybody's happy.
The better option would be to train on the ground in a warehouse with wires just like they do in the movies. They can simulate zero-G just fine with puppeteers and wire systems.
No, they can't, and I've already explained why.
They can do this in a normal atmosphere with less resistance than underwater, so at least it's a little closer to moving around in space and operating and fixing things in space, if it was reality. So, anyways, I mean, we know why they train in a pool. It's for the simple reason that on camera, floating around in a pool has the appearance of floating in space. That's it. Otherwise, it makes no sense whatsoever to train underwater.
Now's the part where he says the pool would be like a giant green screen. What he doesn't seem to realize is a pool would be an incredibly horrible green screen because of things like lighting and shit like that. Now, he showed us pictures of the astronauts changing the backgrounds. Yeah, anybody can cut out a picture and throw it over any background. Look at my avatar here. That's exactly what I'm doing. He's being deliberately deceitful. That's the best way I can put it.
In fact, it's just silly and foolish. But we don't use our brains and ask questions about what they do with our hard-earned money. We just see it on the news and we believe it. Now, here is one of the few instances of an astronaut supposedly in a vacuum chamber. This could be made for TV drama from the 60s, but I think it's probably real.
So he doesn't know if it's real or not, but yet he's going to pass it off as what happens when NASA tests in a vacuum chamber, or when something goes wrong in a vacuum chamber. Not even going to bother to, check the source, check the story, anything like that. No, can't be bothered to do that now. That might blow up in his face and bite him in the ass and fuck up his narrative.
I think that they tried to use a spacesuit in a vacuum chamber, but quickly realized that it's impossible, at least in a high vacuum.
Or maybe they just realized it's incredibly fucking dangerous. And if you look at what this video is called, it's called spacesuit testing. Now, we all know back in the 60s, the guys involved in the space program were pretty fucking ballsy. They had no idea if some of this shit would work, but they went for it, I mean, they were reasonably sure, based on, the research that had been done, but they didn't know 100%. If this guy was testing out a new spacesuit that failed, well, that's the kind of shit that would happen. There's a reason they don't use spacesuits that look like what this guy is wearing.
So they immediately started their policy of only using swimming pools to train, and completely ignoring and remaining silent on the absence of vacuum chamber training of astronauts. And check out the caption. It says, "The video above shows the moments when Jim LeBlanc was subjected to a space-like vacuum, space-like, it's a medium vacuum, in a NASA testing chamber in 1965. Interestingly, although an accident, it's one of the only experiments into how a human would cope in such conditions, and thus our modern knowledge of the effects rely upon this incident." We're relying upon this one time they tried to put somebody in a vacuum chamber? Whew, it's pretty pathetic.
As I stumbled backwards, I could feel the saliva on my tongue starting to bubble just before I went unconscious. And that's kind of the last thing I remember.
I'm just curious, how many more people does this fucking retard want to stick in a vacuum chamber and let something like this happen to? Just keep throwing people in there until somebody actually does die? I mean, he talks about a pool being unsafe, but yet let's train people in a vacuum? Are you fucking kidding me?
Wow, that's pretty crazy. And originally I had a clip of the BBC video with Brian Cox where they dropped a feather and a bowling ball, in a pathetic attempt to prove gravity.
Oh yeah, and did I mention that this mental deficient thinks that gravity is fake too? Yeah, apparently the force that holds us to the ground is one big NASA hoax. And I saw the BBC special that he talked about, and it was simply a demonstration of how gravity would work in a vacuum, where the feather and the bowling ball fall at the exact same rate because there's no air resistance to slow the feather down.
And I had to take it out because that was the first thing that got this video blocked. And I'll put the link in the description, but it's a horrible spectacle showing how they waste massive amounts of our tax money as they prepare the gigantic space power facility and operate it just to film the propaganda feather and bowling ball drop.
I've got the sneaking suspicion that BBC actually paid to use that facility. They paid to have it start up. I don't think that was a big taxpayer drain.
And they all react like it's the greatest thing they've ever seen, and I don't know about anyone else, but I'm sick and tired of working my butt off so these jokers can waste my money on ridiculous productions like this. I mean, this facility is enormous, and even just sitting there unused, it takes massive amounts of money to maintain.
Now, I notice he doesn't put a dollar amount. He just says huge amounts of money to let that thing sit unused. Now, I'm curious as to whether it actually does cost a massive amount of money to let that thing sit there, or if he's being deliberately vague in order to fool his audience.
And even more so when all of the workers have to show up and operate it for the propaganda. Heck, every time you shut the giant door, it probably costs thousands of dollars. And again, we pay them to create propaganda for us. Not the best use of capital, in my opinion.
And again, an opinion based off of, well, nothing, really. Just assumptions and assertions. Nothing really to back up his opinion. So far, we've seen how wrong his opinion is.
And then the next clip is the one that just got this video removed, and this was the clip from Smarter Every Day. I guess he didn't like how ridiculous he and astronaut Donald Pettit looked when they discussed the shutters on the cupola of the International Space Station. They basically talk about the tiny little O-rings that are used to create a seal for the 7 handles that open and close the shutters. They operate the handles from inside the cupola, and these handles close the shutters on the outside of the space station. So for me, the worst part was how ignorant Donald Pettit was when asked what to do in the event of a leak in the seal. He's like, then you have a leak. Probably seal off the cupola. There's probably a plan. I don't know off the top of my head, but there's probably a plan to replace the mechanism. It might require a spacewalk, all nonchalantly. And it's like, what in the world is he thinking? This is horrible. If the ISS were real, there would be a procedure for every possible contingency.
I watched that episode of Smarter Every Day. Link is in the description. And when the O-rings were brought up, he says that there's 7 of them, 1 for each window. He's nonchalant about it because why wouldn't he be? What happens if you get a leak? Well, you have a leak. That's kind of what happens when you get a leak. Then he talks about sealing off the cupola as a possible spacewalk. Why go into a big long explanation about it? Not to mention, why would he even be thinking about what the procedure would be at that moment? He hadn't been to space in 3 years, and procedures change. Why give the public possibly outdated information?
Even the lowest ranking member on a sub will know what to do in the event of an emergency. This is Donald Pettit, an elite astronaut. The astronauts are supposed to be the best and brightest, having to beat out hundreds of qualified people to become a NASA astronaut. I mean, are you kidding me? Where are the drills? What are the procedures? They would have a specific procedure for every type of incident.
I'm pretty sure they do have procedures for all incidents, or anything that they can think of, because a lot of stuff hasn't happened yet. why would you expect a man who hasn't been into space for 3 years to be able to remember one particular thing? That's why they train heavily right before they go to space. So all that stuff is fresh in their mind. They get home, they're not going back into space again for a few years. Fuck it, forget about it. You know, it doesn't need to be on the forefront of their mind all the time. Only when it's necessary. Like when they go to space. Which he wasn't.
Loss of pressure, leaking seals, micrometeorite penetration, ammonia leak. I mean, come on, this is horrible. Where are the drills? The first thing they would show in videos would be them rehearsing drills.
So apparently this guy would rather just see a bunch of people doing drills all the time and none of the science being done. Personally, I'd rather see the science being done. I'll let them do the drills on their own time. I don't care to see it. Who does? Do you want to watch a ISS video where, oh, here's another drill, oh, here's a drill, here's a drill, here's a drill, or here's what we've learned, here's what we've learned, here's something new you've learned. I'd rather learn something than just watch people do drills all day. That's fucking stupid.
But instead, we get videos of spinning stuffed animals and making tacos, washing hair, blowing bubbles in space. I mean, really? Does anyone believe this stuff? If it were real, there would be non-stop, serious drills about how to stay alive in the event of an emergency.
So I guess this guy would rather us just go to space and run drills all the time instead of actually do science and learn things. They show the science and the things that we're learning and the things that interest people, the things that spark curiosity, that answer some people's curiosity, instead of running drills all day. You know, and the guy makes the submarine analogy. Well, do you think submariners spend all day, every day drilling? No. You know, there's mechanics, there navigation people, cooks. How are they going to do their job if they're drilling all the time? The people on the ISS are scientists. They do science, not drill. Yeah, I'm sure they drill from time to time because it's a smart thing to do, but they're not going to let that consume their time up there. They're going to spend that valuable time doing actual science.
Then at the end, Mr. Smarter Every Day even exclaims, "You have the vacuum of space being held back by 2 little bitty O-rings. That's incredible." Well, he's right there. It is incredible that people believe it.
So I guess Mr. Curious Life doesn't think that it's possible for the immense pressure of 200 plus feet of water being held out of a Gorski helmet by tiny little O-rings, because that's what keeps the water out of those. Is that so hard to believe? Or is it just because he doesn't understand what the fuck he's talking about that he thinks it's fake?
And shame on us for being ignorant for all of these years. But anyways, at least we know now, and we can observe these things in greater detail with objectivity. So thanks so much for watching, guys, and I hope you all...
Well, that's it, everyone. Thanks for watching. I'd love to get this guy on a live stream sometime, but I doubt he will. I've noticed that nutballs like this don't like to leave their little echo chambers and be told they're wrong. So, yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. Take care, and see you next time.